So as many of you know, I'm the founder and CEO of Blendoor. And I wanted to just, before I jump in, give you an understanding of how we started and how we pivoted to focus on ratings and analytics. So we started off a blind AI software company focused on mitigating unconscious bias in 2015. So we developed a talent matching enterprise software that leverages all sorts of information about candidates and roles to be able to predict who is a good match for a role while masking name, photo, age, any indication of gender, ethnicity, etc. While on the back end tracking how far along different demographics of candidates make it through every stage of the funnel. So I know a lot of the focus of this course is on behavior change and nudges. This was our design choice around how to not only enable companies to mitigate the bias that goes in the top of funnel screening of candidates, but also create increased transparency around how those decisions impact the demographics of each basically cohort of candidates throughout every stage of the funnel. And on the candidate side, we developed a scoring system for companies so that based on a candidate's identities and values, we could show them which companies where they were most likely to succeed and belong based on a proprietary scoring system that we developed called BlendScore, which rates and ranks companies based on several different metrics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So fast forward to 2020, COVID hit, and despite our success in selling our hiring products, we didn't see a lot of change in terms of the yield of diverse hiring in a lot of the companies that we were working with. And so we took a step back to sort of reevaluate whether or not Blendoor was another check the box solution that companies were using as proxies for their progress and success in DEI, or were they actually leveraging our tools to solve the operational challenges within their organizations? And then, of course, George Floyd happened, and all of a sudden, conversations totally changed from unconscious bias and pipeline problem to how do we create better cultures and enable our company to identify talent and retain talent in a meaningful way. And it was probably the first time in the history of the company where we were no longer focused on this pipeline problem myth, because individuals, for various reasons, from the Black Lives Matter movement to Me Too, et cetera, were fully understanding the scope and complexity of the challenges beyond unconscious bias in the hiring funnel that prevent the meeting of a lot of the diversity goals and pledges that took place 7 years ago. So I'll jump in to what we'll cover in the course and talk a little bit about how we responded to this major shift in social consciousness from a product development and design perspective. So what we'll cover today, I'll discuss a little bit of the impact of this growing interest in ESG and stakeholder capitalism, particularly from the finance sector. Then we'll talk a little bit about how companies are reporting their DEI progress, and how the lack of standardization creates inherent challenges in assessing company progress and accountability. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the ratings, rankings, some research that we've done and the methodologies behind a lot of the scoring systems that both internal stakeholders like DEI chiefs, et cetera, as well as external stakeholders like Blendoor and Glassdoor and several others, Great Places to Work, et cetera, have employed to give job seekers a better sense of how companies are actually putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to DEI. So let's start with ESG. So a recent study by Morgan Stanley found that 79% of individual investors have expressed some interest in sustainable investing. And of course, this has increased significantly since 2019. And we see this particularly concentrated among millennial and Gen Z investors, which, as we know, are becoming a greater proportion of asset managers in the United States and in the UK. So for those of you unfamiliar with ESG, a lot of emphasis to date has been on the E, so carbon footprint, water use, et cetera. But DEI, if you really dig into it, fits quite nicely, more so within the S and the G, and is a little bit trickier to measure and track, in part because a lot of companies have not been incentivized to collect this data over time, and particularly not incentivized to report it publicly. So we're really sort of seeing the first wave of public disclosure for a lot of the social and governance categories within ESG. And significant investment and attention has been put forth from the financial services community as more and more investors are looking to align their portfolios with their broader ESG values. And a significant shift has taken place, as seen from the largest asset manager, BlackRock, which currently I think has $10 trillion worth of assets under management. They have significantly invested in ESG and infrastructure for measurement, as well as the involvement of the SEC, who recognizes that there needs to be a modernization of public disclosure as human capital becomes more and more pivotal to public company success. And that transparency is becoming more and more important for investors. So we are eagerly anticipating Gary Gensler's rules and regulations around what companies will be expected, public companies will be expected to disclose around some of their social and governance. To date, there are a few entities that have taken a stab at standardizing some people metrics and diversity metrics. SASB is probably most well-known, as well as GRI. But the movement that I have been paying closest attention to is actually in Davos, where quite a few, I think like 200 CEOs convened to develop a set of standards around ESG, so people, planet, prosperity, and within the people category have broken down very explicitly what metrics companies should be thinking about in terms of disclosure and measurement. So diversity and inclusion, obviously, but also pay equity, wage ratios, and labor disclosures. So that's sort of the realm of this entire ESG space, which is really born out of this movement away from maximizing shareholder value towards stakeholder capitalism. And it's something that more and more boards are forced with paying attention to, and investors, because we are seeing some of the negative side effects of companies not addressing a lot of the social and what are deemed as political issues, not only within their internal cultures, but with also how their products and services are impacting the world and the people in it. And so we are closely monitoring this ESG space. So from that world, we also have this sort of wild, wild west of self-reporting and regulation. So as mentioned, we have, as a company, pivoted to focus more on ratings and analytics in response to the increased demand by investors and job seekers to understand how companies are performing. But we still see a lot of variability in what companies are telling in terms of how they are creating equitable workplaces, and also their diversity metrics over time, whether it's retention, attrition, promotion, pay equity, et cetera. These reports are often 30 to 100 pages long, filled with all sorts of glossy photos and initiatives that companies have in place, with maybe just a couple pages actually dedicated to their diversity metrics. And even when they do report those diversity metrics, they lack standardization. And so we've had to, as a data aggregator for analysis, piece through and structure data so that we can understand how these companies are performing relative to each other. So for example, this is a glimpse into Google's 2021 diversity report, which I believe is about 40 pages long. So very commonly, companies will show their year-over-year change across race and gender. So here, Google increased the percentage of women by 0.5 percentage, and neglect to show non-binary details, but this is high-level overview. And then race and ethnicity. So these categories are heavy-handed, but are very similar to what the EEOC mandates in the annual reporting required by companies that have over 200 employees, I believe. So similar to gender, Google has reported year-over-year change based on race and ethnicity. In addition to those reports, for companies that operate in the UK and have 250 or more employees, they must report their pay gaps. So here we see that hourly pay gap based on mean and median is relatively small, but when you look at equity, significant differences. And even though Google pays women and men bonuses at about equal rate, it's clear that men are in the top tier of high earners within the organization. And you only really see parity at the lower levels, the lower quartile of pay within the companies. And what's really unique about the UK's movement around pay equity reporting is that they have been very stringent and in terms of how this information is reported, versus a lot of what we've seen in the States is still fuzzy around how companies are both self-measuring, so doing audits on their pay equity, and then also how they report it. So this is really progressive for the UK, because they're really the first to establish standards and norms by which companies across the board have to report this data. It's not perfect, but it's a really good start. And in addition to that, they have this small block on their website around the importance of companies adding a supporting narrative. And my thesis is the supporting narrative is often where companies over-index in their reporting, as opposed to giving more of a realistic picture of their progress across different metrics. But year after year, when companies do not meet goals or improve numbers despite significant investments, it's as simple as saying we're still working on it, right? And all you have to do is, again, load up a report with all the nonprofits that you've helped, K through 12 education that you've facilitated for, Black Girls Code to CS for all of the different attempts you've made to source diverse talent, even though they failed. A lot of companies have been getting away with over the past 7 years with just saying we're working on it. And so that's why we've been really bullish on radical transparency and measurement, because otherwise there really is no way to enforce or regulate the commitments that companies are making around DEI. So in 2020, we put together, it took us about 6 months to put together the State of DEI in Tech report, which not only tracks the progress of companies across race and gender over the past 7 years, but also the pledges that have been made. So just from January to December of 2020, tech companies alone, we unearthed $4.5 billion worth of DEI pledges made, and that spans anything from pay equity to hiring and promotion. And we saw similar commitments made 7 years ago, but still very little progress across different demographics, with the exception of Asian employees. And so this was sort of our effort to create some external accountability for companies that just throw a statement or a black square on a website, but don't really make the extra effort to communicate how they're actually supporting those goals. And so we took a deep dive into the demographics of boards, executive teams, and employees, with the benchmark of overall US workforce participation based on the last published data from the 2018 EEOC report. This is important because what we found over the past 7 years is a lot of tech companies have very similar numbers. And so what the 7 years of annual diversity reports have done, in a way, is normalize mediocrity, right? So it's a lot easier to report that your company is only 5% African American, when all of the companies in that you compete with have similar metrics. But there's a little bit more that needs to be communicated when you compare that with the fact that African Americans make up about 13% of the US population, and similarly about 9 to 11% of college graduates. And so there is further exploration and explanation when you're using a benchmark based on the available talent pool, and not just relative to industry. And so we really wanted to elucidate that in this report, as well as surface some of the pay equities and dynamics involved, even in what we found as gender segregation across different disciplines. So for example, if a company has a chief executive that is a woman, someone in the C-suite, they're more often or not to be a CMO, a CHRO, or a chief diversity officer. And the reason why that's important to make note of is because those are the least likely roles to one, lead to a board seat, but two, they're oftentimes the most underpaid C-suite executives at a company. And we found that out by looking at the DEF 14A proxy statements that public companies report every year to the SEC, where each company has to list their 5 highest paid executives, also known as named executive officers. And through that process of reading through hundreds and hundreds of proxy statements, we uncovered this very common gender segregation and pay discrepancy among executives of publicly traded companies. And all of that we sort of wrapped up in this report. Okay, so how am I doing on time? I may have to slow down a bit. I'm used to going really fast. Okay, so coming off that report, we got quite a bit of feedback and interest, particularly from the general public, job seekers and employees. And again, immediately after the murder of George Floyd, we just saw a huge influx of interest in from consumers to investors to job seekers around company cultures as it relates to DEI. And from a company perspective, as mentioned, we launched our scoring system in 2017, but in 2020, it took on a totally different purpose as more and more companies were looking for diagnostics, right? So as mentioned, when we received increased inbound requests for companies just trying to understand where to start, we recognized that there was a need for developing a framework and transparent methodology to give companies a sense of where they are in their journey because of the complexities involved in really operationalizing DEI throughout an organization. So the signals were consistent across industry as we saw companies like Glassdoor launch a diversity inclusion product in 2020, again, in response to the demand for increased data, but more specifically, this growing area of employer branding. So now companies, in addition to broader branding risk associated with, not paying people fairly or hiring discrimination, because of the increased transparency around this data, are thinking critically about how these metrics are influencing their employer brand. And so there are some companies that are very forward thinking and have dedicated employer branding positions to really speak to job seekers about what experience they can expect to have given the intersections of their race, gender, sexual orientation, even caretaking responsibilities, especially now as there's an increased emphasis on flexibility and remote work. We're finding that these technology companies in HR are trying to push out more and more products that can speak to the increased power that job seekers are having in the marketplace to be more choosy about where to work and not just compensation and benefits. So this isn't new, right? We've seen these ratings and rankings, Great Place to Work, Diversity Inc., and a broader diversity perspective, but also some that are specifically catered towards certain protected classes. So Fairy God Boss and In Her Sight are both ratings companies specifically for women. The best places to work for LGBT equality comes from the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index, which lists all of the companies that received 100% rating on their index. There are also ratings for parents and people with disabilities and people in the military, you name it. There's a rating or ranking. The challenge with these, however, they are solicited rankings, meaning they require a company to fill out a survey once a year, denoting what sort of policies and programs and diversity metrics that they are collecting. So one, it's not dynamic. Two, it requires, obvious buy-in and time commitment from companies. And three, there really, again, lacks standardization and really like a trusted source for this information in the way that we see like the US News World Report rankings working for universities and hospitals. And so I think that's the North Star for a lot of us that are in this sort of employer branding marketplace, is to have that brand recognition and trust so that our standards will proliferate throughout different industries. And a lot of that trust is built, I believe, with extreme transparency around the methodologies for the ratings and rankings, as well as the process for data collection. So I'll go into a little bit around some of those methodologies and how it compares internally versus externally, in part because I think some of the larger challenges related to the efficacy of diversity reporting is this idea that if companies just measure and self-regulate, we'll see a lot of these things improving. And that really hasn't been the case for the past 7 years that we've seen it, particularly in tech. So I've sort of laid out here just a loop of my understanding of from years of research of how different ratings and ranking systems develop. So one, establishing a framework, building trust around that framework, the actual data collection and analysis, and then reporting of that data and incorporating feedback to improve frameworks. So for BlendScore, as an external auditor and rating system, we have different pillars: leadership, impact, retention, and recruitment. And we outline exactly all of the different weights and how we calculate Z-scores and normalize data based on industry and company size and locations. But also what's unique about the scoring methodology that we used is we responded to the demand for how companies are creating more inclusive workplaces, because the emphasis to date has been really on just the diversity metrics, right? And so we collected a ton of different benefits, initiatives, partnerships, pledges, best practices from all sorts of different external sources to identify which companies were performing well, not just on their ability to attract talent and sustain certain numbers, but also create inclusive and equitable cultures. Similarly, I sit on the board of Fair Pay Workplace, which is a 501c3 and C6 nonprofit, which has taken the very bold step of being the standard metric for fair pay. So as mentioned, that sort of US News World Report or LEAD sort of trusted marking is what we hope will enable companies to adhere to some sort of standard practices around pay equity and measurement and remediation, but also for external stakeholders to be able to identify, much the same way you do your food or different consumer products, which companies are actually employing fair pay practices at a system level, not just through the annual reporting that they do for UK pay gap or elsewhere. But there are also some companies who do this internally. And, you know, the first step, and usually the hardest step, is identifying what to measure. There's so many different protected classes and ways in which you can think about things like race and ethnicity, gender, religion, caretaking, and it can become a little overwhelming, but figuring out how you want to structure the data, if you have the infrastructure to measure via software or other means, is a really critical role for any company that's starting some sort of internal process for understanding where they are in their DEI performance. And then benchmarking. And I think this is a step that a lot of companies skip. They like to just report where they are year over year and how they're improving. But the much more challenging but relevant thing is to actually incorporate benchmarking and develop some form of analysis. So you're not just reporting on performance relative to prior years, but how you are remaining competitive industry-wide or country-wide across different demographics and measurements of equity and inclusion. And then the last piece is tracking and accountability. So creating an internal system where you have not only ability as an organization, and not just in HR, but really organization-wide, to see how things are progressing in terms of retention, attrition, pay equity, but also the capability to create accountability for individual stakeholders. I think this is also a key piece that's missing in this whole DEI diagnostics world, is that it's really hard for progress to be made if individuals aren't incentivized and equipped to actually improve upon whatever KPIs that a company establishes. And even getting buy-in on why those KPIs are important. So it's really hard for internal self-regulation to be effective without significant emphasis placed on these three steps. And that requires significant investment. And frankly, it's easier for companies to just go out and buy hiring software than it is to implement a system-wide measurement and tracking and accountability tool for improving some of these things. But we see it done in finance and marketing and other domains within the business. It's just not, the DEI industry has not yet matured to this level of understanding, I believe, in terms of why this is important and why it needs to be tracked, but it's changing. So in terms of establishing the trust to collect this data, this is something that we often hear some concerns about, is how do I ask about race? How do I ask about sexual orientation. And the EEOC actually lays out very clearly what's legal to ask applicants before applying. They have this thing called a tear-off rule, where basically you can ask about protected class identities so long as the data is kept separate from individuals and thus not used throughout the hiring process, but primarily used anonymously in aggregate for analysis purposes. So that's the means through which most companies are getting their demographic data. We actually go direct to consumer with sort of the carrot that if you tell us about you, we can tell you what companies you match with, right? And so it's our way of establishing trust outside of just the paradigm of collecting data for analysis. We're giving the end user relevant information back as a result of providing information about their identity, but of course still anonymized and aggregated. So that's just for diversity collection. For internal collection about, culture, how different demographics of people are experiencing your company. I highly recommend Culture Amp, but there are, again, guidelines that should be followed to optimize for that data collection, because it's a lot more involved than just designating your identities. And without it, companies have found it very challenging to get the self-reported data needed to do any significant analysis, and in which case they often leave it up to an external party, but there are pros and cons with internal versus external data collection. So Blendoor is a data aggregator, right? We have built systems that crawl the web, crawl various public and private data sets to get the information we collect on the companies that we monitor. But they're also very seamless tools that organizations use through their human capital management software that tracks all of the information mentioned, and even more. It's just often that data isn't reported to most stakeholders. It sits in HR, or for legal reasons, companies don't report publicly, but that dynamic is changing. And we're seeing sort of this trend of the blend of the internal and external. A signal of this is acquisition UKG just completed a few months ago of Great Place to Work. So what's notable about this, and really exciting for those of us who are people analytics nerds, is that now not only is Great Place to Work leveraging the surveys, but they can actually get benchmarks, analysis, and recommendations based on the wide swath of enterprise customers that they have using their internal human capital management tools. And this is really aligned with the broader industry around resource planning that Oracle and IBM and many other companies are already bought into. But what's unique about specifically human capital management is, given how it is the largest expense of the majority of S&P 500 companies, this data, much like financial data, is becoming more and more relevant to investors, and hence the sort of growth in demand by regulators. So, okay, I got 5 minutes left. So on the topic of analysis, so as mentioned, there are certification companies that enable companies to understand the numbers, the meaning behind the numbers, but also reports that already exist. So the EEO-1 form, as mentioned, is required by any company over a certain number of employees. And particularly for companies that have government contracts, there is an effort for companies to be required to make this information public. But there are some loopholes actually created under the Obama administration that prevent some companies from responding to FOIA requests for their EEO-1 forms. There's a lawsuit currently underway because companies like Palantir have claimed competitive reasons for why they should not have to disclose their diversity data. And so those are some of the impediments that we as data aggregators have in getting the most accurate snapshot of of company diversity. But the reality is that, or I should say, the bright side is the data is already being collected. It's already being reported. It's just a matter of aligning regulator interests with investor interests and public interests so that this data can be made public. And internally, we're seeing more and more companies create scorecards and dashboards, again, oftentimes just meant to compare where they are relative to some other moment in time, but we're seeing greater sophistication in the ways in which companies are identifying problem areas and bolstering whatever prescriptions they can based on those areas. And probably the hardest part of this entire process, given that DEI is relatively nascent and there aren't a lot of standards, is processing client feedback, right? So we, as you know, as a score provider, there are all sorts of decisions that have to be made that aren't optimal, that aren't based on any significant academic rigor, but you have to start somewhere and you have to test. And much like other product development, incorporate feedback from different stakeholders to bolster your score, but also increase the trust that is required for any sort of rating system, monitoring tool to really be taken seriously and used throughout the business. So key takeaways is one, regulators and investors play a really big role. BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, SEC, you name it, everyone is paying attention right now. And ESG is here to stay. But the Achilles heel is standardization and this ongoing virtue signaling that companies are able to do because of the lack of governance and rigor in assessing whether or not these companies are actually performing at the levels of their pledges. But what is often neglected is the amount of trust required throughout every aspect of the process, whether it's building a framework, collecting data about people that is some cases very personal, and then reporting on that progress in a way that many different people have to come to respect and leverage when they are making key decisions about where to work and where to invest. What gives me hope is this country's past of rectifying labor-related, human capital-related challenges with enough campaigning. And I know a lot of this course is focused on some of the challenges and downfalls of DEI over the course of the past 7 years. And I really think a lot of it has due to an overinvestment in what people hope to be sort of this silver bullet approach. And I think it's going to take a multifaceted effort from both the public and private sector, as well as external auditors and rating systems, much like we've seen in the financial industry, in order for real change to happen. We just simply cannot leave companies to their own devices to improve these things, because honestly, they aren't financially incentivized to do so. Though there are quite a few reports that talk about the business case for diversity, it's really, really hard to prove and justify with any significant academic rigor. But we have made some progress. We have made strides when there is a collective effort, both internally and externally, to move along progress. And so with that, I will close and open it up for questions.